It is surely because if there is no such thing as reality, then ultimately, as far as we can know, mind alone exists. And if mind is not the product of real matter, but rather is the creator of the illusion of material reality, which has in fact, despite the materialists, been known to be the case since the discovery of quantum mechanics in 1925, then a theistic view of our existence becomes the only rational alternative to solipsism. And now let Mikio Kaku explain why this is the case.
Erwin Schrodinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, designed a thought experiment to drive home the strange rules of his theory. Let's say we put a cat and a vial of poison in a box. We add an atom of radioactive uranium and a Geiger counter. If the uranium decays, it sets off the Geiger counter, which then releases the poison and silently kills the cat. Before we open the box and look, we can't actually know whether the uranium has decayed or not, since radioactive decay is a probabilistic quantum event.
Here's the question. Is the cat dead or alive? Well, according to quantum mechanics, the cat is neither dead nor alive, but the sum of the two states. Well, at that point, you say, well, that's nonsense. That's preposterous. How can you be both dead and alive simultaneously?
Schrodinger's cat was supposed to show that nothing in this universe is certain until someone makes a measurement. But another pioneer of quantum mechanics, Eugene Wigner, believed it could teach us something else about the working of the universe. That consciousness controls everything.
Wigner said, let's take it one step farther. If I, a human being, looks at the cat, I am conscious. Therefore, consciousness determines existence. At that point, Einstein went ballistic and said, what? You're saying that the fact that you are a conscious being determines the fact that the cat is alive? Answer is yes. And Wigner made one more step. And that is, how do I know I'm alive? You see, the cat and me, we're part of the same universe. If I don't know the cat is alive or dead, I could also be dead at the same time and not even know it. So who determines that I'm alive? Well, Wigner's friend looks at me, I look at the cat, and we exist. But then who looks at Wigner's friend? And there's an infinite chain of people looking at people, until finally you hit cosmic consciousness. Some consciousness that's ethereal, that envelops the universe, which looks at us and says, aha, the cat is alive.
I would even go as far to say that this position is more logical than the solipsist position, because in this case one can point out that our mind doesn't create reality, it only participates in it. In other words, we are not the architect, or have the ability to change the structure of the world through mental processes. Remember the scenario set up in the quantum enigma about opening the box. If we decide to look in one box and find where the atom is, we do not actually decide where it will end up. We just use our free will to participate in deciding what the outcome will be, whether a wave or a particle result. But we don't get to choose the specifics. So the evidence suggests we are just lesser minds dependent on a much larger one that is actually in control of the structure of the experience.
Anyone dumb enough to take Schrodinger's thought experiment literally, and who doesn't understand that it's simply a metaphor, doesn't deserve to be taken seriously, and you shouldn't be listening to his videos, especially when he's trying to further an agenda that misrepresents science in order to prove his imaginary friend. We're done.
And we are allowed to operate and be able to participate in the outcome of the idealist experience. Now, one objection to the theistic perspective is raised in the quantum enigma. If God is observing the physical world, and us in it, then how come we can do experiments showing something unobserved is in a superposition? In other words, if God is looking down at everything, the strange rules of quantum mechanics should never have been verified, since they are always being observed by God. Well, this is a misunderstanding. God is not separate from us, someplace in space observing us, as space and matter are illusions of our conscious observation, as the falsification of realism shows. The existence of the physical world is created by our observation of it, and it doesn't exist other than that. So what is there for God to observe other than what we see? Consciousness is what is fundamental, and our consciousness would be dependent on a larger one. God is in a sense observing us having an experience of the physical world, and apart from our experience, there is nothing that needs to be observed, as it exists in the state of a wave function. So he is not separate from us, as our consciousness is dependent on his, and he doesn't need to see an independent experience of the physical world. So thus we can conclude no other. Given the scientific evidence that has led us this far, what other inference does this lead to? Of course, one can always refuse to go with us to the logical conclusion, but that does not refute the conclusion or change it. Science has not buried God, it has revealed him, and with it buried materialism. It remains now only in the fantasy of materialists.
Who's a moron? You're a moron! Yes, you are! Yes, you are!
Hold on. Here's a thought. The ideas and conclusions which IP conveys in his videos sound very similar to ideas I've heard from someone else. You'll be the judge of the accuracy of this comparison.
Materialism was the view of many scientists at the turn of the 20th century. This simplistic view that all that existed was matter and energy, and the rearrangements of it, is the extreme view of realism. Realism is a general belief accepted by many today, that a physical reality exists independent of observation. And roughly 100 years ago, most held to one of these two views, rejecting the opposing view, idealism, the view that reality is a mental construct and doesn't exist independent of observation. For many back then, their understanding of physics seemed to favor this side of the spectrum, firmly believing it buried idealism. However, this realistic worldview was shaken with the advent of quantum mechanics.
I think I'm going to have to say that science is now in a process of overthrowing the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism. That everything that we call matter comes from something that is not material. That the essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. That the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff.
According to the Schrodinger equation, independent of observation, particles exist in a state of a wave function, which is a series of potentialities rather than actual objects. The very act of observing causes this wave of potentialities to collapse to a state of matter.
And science also tells us, and if there are any scientists who want to disagree with them, please come up during the question and answer session. Science tells us that nature is a discontinuity, that it's an on-off phenomenon, that there are gaps between every two ons, where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality. Science doesn't call it God, but what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be?
For objective reality to be true, and the world to exist independent of observation, something known as locality would have to follow, which means for objects to interact, they need to be in close proximity. But experiments in the early 80s showed this is not the case. Instant interaction can be seen between two particles that are separated from great distances. This is what we now know as entanglement, and it makes more sense if the world is virtual. In a virtual world, space doesn't limit correlations.
Science also tells us that this is a field of non-locality, where everything is correlated with everything else. My adversaries are going to point out, no, everything, God is explained by neurology. Well, I hope today, Michael, that you will convert from a skeptic to a neuroskeptic, because your science is really frozen in the dungeons of conservatism and in the dungeons of orthodoxy. Today, science tells us that the essential nature of reality is non-local correlation. Everything is connected to everything else.
If God is looking down at everything, the strange rules of quantum mechanics should never have been verified, since they are always being observed by God. Well, this is a misunderstanding. God is not separate from us, someplace in space observing us, as space and matter are illusions of our conscious observation, as the falsification of realism shows. The existence of the physical world is created by our observation of it, and it doesn't exist other than that.
That there's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movement and motion and energy and matter. We can have a personal relationship with this intelligence, because we have a consciousness that is part of the sea of consciousness.
Consciousness is what is fundamental, and our consciousness would be dependent on a larger one. God is in a sense observing us, having an experience of the physical world. And apart from our experience, there is nothing that needs to be observed, as it exists in the state of a wave function. So he is not separate from us, as our consciousness is dependent on his.
It is impossible for a physical system, no matter how complex it is, to process meaning, to process creativity, to process purpose, to process even, you can map it out, you can show the molecules there, but it is impossible for a physical system to feel those qualities.
The properties of the mind are not that which matter can have. This can be seen with the difference between mental properties and physical properties. Consider two things, feeling pain and an electrical signal to the brain. Are they the same thing? Of course not.
Our minds are not by themselves. They are part of a matrix of mind or information.
One can find a much simpler explanation that the universe is being simulated in a mind. This would solve many problems of being simulated on a computer, because a mind has elements of integrated information states and also processes information. Prior to measurement, objects have no defined properties or location. The act of a conscious observer creates the existence of the physical objects and the properties they entail, instantly.
The moon is really there whether you look at it or not. It doesn't apply to the macro world.
In the absence of a conscious entity, the moon remains a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup.
Deepak, that is...
That you have to have a conscious being.
The moon?
Yes.
Okay, listen to the sounds.
Will you really trust someone who spews as much bullshit as he does?
Rational arguments don't usually work on religious people. Otherwise, there would be no religious people.